Tom, welcome very much, and thank you very much for joining us today. I mean, I think everybody knows who you are by now, one of the most influential people in education at the moment for all the work you have been doing in developing evidence-based approaches, and that's a little bit what I want to talk to you about today. And specifically look at two recent pieces of work that you've done, which are Rosenshine's Principles in Actions and the teaching walkthroughs. So to start us off with Rosenshine, it's fair to say that his work hasn't always been that fashionable in education circles. So I was kind of wondering how you first came across Rosenshine and what sort of attracted you to his work.
Oh, well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you, first of all. But yeah, I mean, I have a huge debt to the sort of the Twitter world. I'm often saying to people, that Twitter has changed my whole working practices, and it's because it's allowed people to share things which previously may have been only held in kind of official libraries or research databases where you have to have a subscription and so on. And I first came across Rosenshine's Principles seeing this blue poster that Oliver Caviglioli made, and I now work with him all the time, but at that time I didn't really know him. But he made the summary of Rosenshine's Principles, and I just quickly scanned across it and thought, well, all of those things sound really sensible. So I quickly accessed the paper, which is a free PDF. You can just read it anytime. This is such a neat way of summarizing so many things which teachers are trying to do well all the time. And I was surprised that I hadn't heard of him before, because I was thinking, well, how come I've been teaching for so long and never heard of Barrett Rosenshine? And that's because I just think the worlds of research and teaching haven't overlapped well enough. And then there was this thing freely available on the internet. Yeah, so that was how I came across it. And then because I was doing lots of training with teachers, I was thinking, well, people kept asking me, well, what's the best way to get into research? What's the best way to quickly get a sense of it? And I thought, well, this captures a lot of ideas. So read this. This will get you started. And that's where it started, really, that interest. And it was such a simple condensation. And he expresses the ideas very, very succinctly, which cuts through to teachers really well.
Yes, and you mentioned there kind of the role of Twitter in sort of making some of those things more accessible. Now, Twitter, of course, is something that's been at times controversial in the education community as well. But your view is it's generally been a helpful thing in terms of what educators can do?
Definitely, because I feel like, I mean, the fact that, probably the fact that you know me and I know who you are, and it goes for lots of other people, is because of Twitter. So you can engage directly with Dan Willingham or Dylan William or Efrat Frust and all these other people who are fantastic cognitive scientists, but also a new teacher in any part of the world who's just interested. And it has a sort of leveler aspect, which is, I feel there's a sort of democratization there. You've got a teacher who's talking about their lesson, that they were trying to do something, and sharing that alongside someone who's a researcher with a lot of experience and a PhD or whatever. So it's just allowed all these worlds to kind of mingle. Of course, you have to filter out some aspects of the discussion. And I think debating on Twitter is complex and not ideal. But in terms of just sharing what's available, I think it's absolutely magnificent.
Well, yes, and I would agree with you. And also, we have definitely seen this kind of democratization, I think, happening. And I think that's a really exciting development. So looking then more specifically at Rosenshine, you obviously developed those ideas further in your work on Rosenshine's Principles or Principles in Action. So what was kind of the impetus for that, sort of going beyond just getting people to read the articles?
Well, what I found was that I was doing, so my work now is, most of the time I'm in a school doing a training day. So most of my work is either going around a school with one of the leaders and looking at lessons and then helping them construct a training program around that and based on what we see. So I watch a lot of lessons in lots of different schools. And then the other thing is me actually delivering training myself. That's the other half. So I have lots of experience of talking to teachers. So what I found was that with the Rosenshine's principles, that people want examples. People don't just want to hear, here's a generic idea. You can say something like guided practice or scaffolding. These are sort of terms. But what do you mean? So what I found was with the inaction was that through watching lessons and through my own experience as a teacher and so on, that I was able to sort of provide examples. So here's an example of what it would look like to do daily review, or the subtle difference between daily review and weekly and monthly review, as Rosenshine calls it.
Yeah.
And so it's through the exemplification that people understand the concept.
Yeah.
And I found that's what really people found very helpful. And I was doing a talk for Research Ed about Rosenshine's principles, and somebody asked something. The reason I wrote the book is somebody said, a publisher said, if you could capture that talk in a book kind of thing, that would go down well, but keep it short. And so I wrote the shortest book I could get away with. And but it's the examples. That's what I find helps. People like to know how a general idea manifests itself in a given situation.
Yeah.
And then to follow on from that is, therefore you need to give examples across a range of contexts. So in maths, it might look like this, and in teaching history, it might look like this, so that teachers don't feel excluded. One of the things I found over time is, if teachers feel you're talking about other people, they kind of shut down, naturally enough. So that you need to make it feel relevant to them by showing that there are different ways of interpreting an idea in a given context.
Yeah, and in a sense, what that's doing is applying some of the principles we know to our own sort of professional development work, isn't it? Which is something we probably don't do enough in education in general. Yeah,
definitely, yeah. I mean, you do, and I find what I'm doing a lot in my work is mediating this sort of tension between having a sort of defined idea, so it doesn't just turn into anything anyone likes, but also allowing people to feel some ownership of it. So if I'm an art teacher, the idea of scaffolding and practice still applies, and it means certain things, but it's not the same way that a maths teacher will be applying that, or say someone with science, where you're just trying to say do some retrieval practice. And I have been in situations where you've got that's not going well. So you've got art teachers feeling they're supposed to do sort of quizzing. You don't have to be quizzing in art. It's not appropriate. So sometimes you have to work with people as they encounter these ideas. They know they want to do the right thing, but they need to be given the confidence to adapt it to be meaningful in their given situation.
Yes, and that's always kind of important, isn't it? When we translate anything from research to education practice, it's never just a straightforward matter of saying, okay, this is what the research found, now do exactly the same in your classroom, is it? That's so obviously that work is really landed well in the profession. People are clearly saying, okay, this works for us, those principles are valuable, those examples are valuable. But do you think there are any kind of pitfalls to relying on Rosenshine that we need to be aware of?
There are a few. I mean, but sometimes I feel it's not, and it's definitely not Rosenshine's fault, because I think I always say this to people, even in some of his own writing around it. He says his own principles apply mainly where there's a sort of structured knowledge content, is the way he'd phrase it. So, or where there's sort of definitely instructional teaching is required. So typically more for novice learners, and then if you start thinking Rosenshine's principles is some sort of panacea for all things or covers all of teaching, it sets us up to be something it's not even trying to be. So I think that's important. So of course, but Rosenshine doesn't even talk about reading, for example, or he doesn't talk about feedback. So there's things he talks about, how to instruct a class to engage them all and get them engaged in retrieval practice and things like moving from guiding the practice to independent practice. But so there's lots of other things that you need to do as well as a teacher, which are not included. So that's the first thing. The other thing is to be too rigid about it in a sort of checklisting.
Yeah.
So that's the other common error, is that people do start saying, well, we should be doing a daily review makes it sound like you must do this every day kind of thing. And it doesn't really mean that you must do it. It's just that it's a sort of, if you can build it into a routine so that you're regularly checking that students can remember what we did yesterday to build on it today, that's helpful. But it doesn't mean it's an absolute rule.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to happen at the start of every lesson.
No.
Retrieval can be woven into the fabric of a learning process without it being the 5 minutes here where we all must do it. So you do get quite simplistic interpretations, but that's not the fault of the paper. It's just people trying to be too precise about the implementation, and that can be a pitfall, I think.
Yeah, and of course the one of the backgrounds there, I think, is because we've got a bit of a tradition of that in the education system. I'm sure you remember the clock from the National Literacy Strategy, for example, with its 5 minutes. So yeah, I think indeed not having a sort of lesson template that you have to apply every time is probably an important thing for people to remember as well. Yes, that's okay. And if you were to give some advice to teachers on what are the most important things to take away from Rosenshine's principles, what would that be?
The thing I always think is, I say is the most important thing when I'm going through it is the concept of checking for understanding. It's something which it amuses me that in a very early form of Rosenshine's work, he wrote this paper called Teaching Functions in the 80s, where he was, and it's a beautiful thing, you can find it sort of typed before computers were there.
Yeah.
In that, there are 6 teaching functions. It's the same research. He's looking at what effective teachers are typically doing in lessons. And he underlines checking for understanding. So it's this idea that while we're teaching, while we're instructing, as we think we're explaining things, is to have in your mind that someone out there isn't following, or they might not be. And I can't tell just by looking at them or asking them, is everybody following?
Yeah, sure.
And he literally says that, the how not to check for understanding is to say, have you understood? You have to say, what have you understood? So let me just check. What do you think I'm saying? What do you think this means? What do you think the story is about? So checking for understanding, I think, is the most important concept, and it really makes you think hard during a lesson. And this is the crucial bit. You do it so that you then adjust your teaching according to what you hear. Mm-hmm. It's not like you just ask the question and then carry on anyway. So it's this idea of being responsive. So I've got to find out, how's this going down, and then be prepared to go back and reteach things if I have to, because it hasn't quite landed yet. And that's the key. It's that responsive teaching aspect that Rosenshine is saying, which means that instructional teaching, as Rosenshine defines it, is very interactive. It's not all about standing there and telling students things. It's about loops of checking and then and being responsive. And that, to me, is the key message that Rosenshine is giving. If you read what he's actually saying.
Yeah, there is sometimes, I think, in some people's mind, a tension there between the need to get through a curriculum or to get through a particular topic, and then that need to check for understanding, and as you say, reteach if that understanding isn't there. What would you say about kind of resolving that?
I think that's a really common thing. I think the main way to resolve that is to have much longer term knowledge goals and be very precise with students about what they are. So if students know that this is what we're trying to deliver, this will be the kind of writing we're trying to aim at producing, or this is the kind of set of phrases in a language, or here's the knowledge content for this topic we're aiming at, then students can have a sort of develop some agency around working towards it. And even if we're going back to reteach things now, we haven't lost sight of that goal. And it means that you allow yourself time later to accelerate faster.
Yeah.
But it's just a false economy, if you like, to cut the corners on embedding the foundational knowledge early on. I think the important thing is consolidation. So Rosenshine expresses that through one of the principles, which is achieve a high success rate.
Yeah.
His view is that, and he uses a number which is about 80%, which is a kind of nominal number, really. And there are some studies, but I don't think you should be too worried about the figure. It's high, so it's encouraging teachers to be consolidating learning to a high level a lot of the time, and then pushing students a bit beyond that, rather than say something like a 50% success rate would suggest it's very difficult a lot of the time. So I feel that that's an important message. In order to maximize the kind of efficiency of getting through a curriculum, focusing on consolidation and practice is actually the way to do it, because you're building secure foundations, which allows you to get to the end. Sometimes you don't trust that, so they don't trust that's going to happen, so they just march on through, and sure enough, they find they're not building on secure knowledge, and it actually ends up being less time efficient. Yeah,
yes, because you end up having to, at some point, reteach it anyway if that knowledge isn't there, because you're not going to have the understanding to go to next steps, are there? Yeah. Okay, so now I'd like to, obviously, your most recent work with Oliver Cavaglioli has been producing the teacher walkthroughs, which again have been a very successful initiative. Can you tell me a bit more about the background to that and what you and Oliver were trying to achieve with that?
Yes, well, Oliver, a couple of years ago now, approached me with this idea that he felt that he's very good at reading kind of the system, because he's engaged with Twitter and teachers as well, and he felt there was a kind of growing consensus around some defined ideas in teaching from a number of different sources, including things like Doug Lamont's Teach Like a Champion and Rosenshine's Principles and some other sources. And he felt like there was an opportunity to capture this set of ideas so that they didn't get lost in the future and didn't get distorted. And he done a lot of reading around the idea of instructional coaching and the need for what someone like Jim Knight, who's an instructional coaching speaker, would call the playbook, the things you use as your toolkit when you're talking about teaching. So he had this idea that we could make this resource like a library of established practices in teaching, but use a visual guide. So that was the initial concept. And he asked me because he'd seen that I was, through my blogging, was writing sort of short sort of descriptions of teaching. So we just got together and we worked out what sorts of things we might include that teachers always think about. And then we had this idea that just partly from a design perspective, but also it would give a routine to the engagement with the ideas, to break everything down into 5 steps.
Yeah, right.
And we explored that a little bit and we thought, would that work? So we tested out several. We thought, yeah, you could. I mean, 5 steps is quite a useful number. It feels about right. And then, yeah, so we produced the book and it took off immediately. So what we found is that people were saying that they've been having conversations in lots of schools and colleges, but when you're having a conversation, the need to find a reference point for the possibilities was always something which people were struggling with. And even Teach Like a Champion is quite a fat book, and not every teacher has it. So we thought we need to make something which is available to everyone. So we tried to make these books sort of thin and short and relatively cheap. And the Kindle is only sort of £3. We tried to make it sort of maximally available. And then we've developed some sort of support materials around that, which is just another sort of level to it. But the book, the idea of the walkthroughs is that it is this sort of playbook that you just have liberally around everywhere that teachers are constantly referring to, so that when I'm talking about checking for understanding and you're talking about checking for understanding, we're talking about the same defined strategy, not just the version we have in our own head. So that's how it came about. And so it really, the idea for it came from Oliver, and then I kind of did the writing, and he did all the graphics.
Okay, yeah. And obviously that's again, that's really hit home with the profession. Do you think that it's in part answering a need for a common language in schools? Because I think not just amongst teachers, but to be quite frank, amongst education researchers as well, there's often a bit of confusion about what things actually mean, and concepts are often used in different ways. Different words mean different things. So do you think it's partly addressing that particular need?
Definitely. I mean, and that's what I found. That's the feedback we get all the time. In fact, one of the projects we're working on is with a group of schools in Harrogate, which is in London, and there are 50 primary schools, and they're all part of this partnership. And the person who runs that says it's just amazing now going around to all the different schools and hearing all the meetings, and people are talking about scaffolding, check for understanding, cold calling, and certain retrieval practice techniques are the same, and because they've got the same resources, the same reference point, and there's a kind of coherence to it, which previously they were finding hard to generate at a training level. So definitely, I found that's been very powerful, and it's amazing how quickly people deviate from an idea. You have to constantly refer back to things. So if what we say is that the walkthroughs are not a sort of a set of rules you must follow. They're almost like an agenda for a discussion. So,
right.
Do you do this? Do you do that? What about this? What about that? So when we're defining them with a sense that keep to the script in terms of your evaluation, but it's not, you're always adapting as you go along.
Right. Yeah.
A concept of adapt, which is you've got to then make it your own, but as long as you don't deviate too far from that definition. But I found it massively powerful to have a reference. Even now when I'm working with a teacher myself and I get the materials open, you say, so look, this is what I mean when I'm saying elaborative interrogation, it means this. It's not just, and then the other thing is that when you leave the meeting that you're in, you carry that with you. You can still have some confidence that people are referring to it in their own time as well as when they're together. Whereas previously, that's where you'd have this sort of divergence and mutation of ideas into sort of a bit of a mush. But yeah, so that I found that very, very a strength of it, a clear strength of the whole idea. And I could give you lots of examples of that. Like one of my favorite ones was I worked with I was talking to a teacher who had the book, and she said, I really love this idea of I was saying one of my favorite behavior management strategies is positive framing. I think it's very effective. And she was saying, oh, I agree. I like positive framing. I always have very high expectations of students. And I'm always making them reach, aspire to reach high goals. And I was saying, no, well, actually, that's not what positive framing means. Positive, that's called setting having high expectations, or pitching it up. There's different ones. But positive framing means very specifically when you correcting students' behavior, you don't say, will you stop talking and stop turning around? You say what you want. You say, can I have you looking and listening? Thank you. And you reaffirm what you want them to do. That's what it means. It means instead of saying stop running down the corridor, you say, let's have everybody walking calmly. Thank you. You say what you want. And she was saying, oh yeah, that's what it means. And so very quickly, even though she'd said she'd read it, she'd immediately reverted back to her own just interpretation of the phrase at the title level, positive framing, and made it into this other thing. So you have to be quite deliberate about it and say, no, let's make sure when I'm saying positive framing and you're saying it, we're talking about the same thing, and let's look at what it is. And then so it definitely has immediate power in that way.
Yes. So obviously, the work have just also been translated into Dutch as the Doorloopjes. How did that come about?
Well, I think it just came about again from René Kuiper. I think I pronounced his name right.
Yeah.
Yeah, saw it via social media, I think, and was realized that there was an appetite for the same kind of process in Holland, in the Netherlands, and approached us to do a translation. So to begin with, he just wanted to translate the book, but then another organization got involved. I think they're called Leerkracht. I can't pronounce it.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
With a big family of schools that they work with, to do a much bigger project. So they approached us to say, well, if René is doing the translation of the book, there are some things we would be interested in maybe tweaking a bit. And then they had this vision for a whole sort of program built around it. And so which they've done, they've got all sorts of teachers making videos. And so the way it's been launched in the Netherlands is actually extraordinary production values. We're still blown away by that. Yeah, but that's how it came about. I mean, I think he approached us, and we were really pleased for him to want to do it. And we love the parallel thing. So even some of we had a meeting where we were asked to sort of, could we do some walkthroughs a bit more like the system that was being used in those schools? And so we adapted it a bit more for them. But actually, that's where Oliver did some additional kind of diagrams and which are more bespoke. But largely, it's a direct translation. I assume. I can't verify that. But yeah, that's how it came about. It was again, René was engaged with him on social media, and he's seen the book, and he just immediately thought, yeah, this was go down well. So seems to have done, which is really exciting.
Great. And if there was one piece of advice you would give the teachers in schools about how to use the walkthroughs, what would it be?
I think the main thing is to select the walkthroughs to focus on only one or two or a few things at a time. So not to filter out quickly so that you're focusing. That's one thing. And then the selection you make should be based not around how you feel about things for yourself, but about what you think your students need. So do I think my students need more work on retrieval practice? Then look at those strategies. Is it something where you feel like more live modeling would help them understand what to do better? So then you work on the live modeling so that they produce better writing or whatever. So we term that solve the learning problems. So choose something which you feel will solve a problem that your students have, rather than it being about a deficit in yourself as a teacher. And
right.
You depersonalize it a bit. So every teacher can improve in some way, but you meet a new class. You might be a very experienced teacher. You might meet a new class where actually they're quite shy, and you want them to get involved in more dialogue. So using things like lots more pair share might be useful, so they encourage them to talk more. And so that's the reason you do it. It's not about what you need, it's about what they need. And that to me and I find that message really helps people feel sort of bold about taking things on, because they're not, that in choosing something, you're not saying, I'm not very good at this. You're choosing it because your students need it, and that helps you sort of get, focus on it with some intensity.
Great. I'm now going to just finish off with a more general question to you, which is, in the Netherlands, there is quite a bit of concern about kind of declining outcomes in education and the system not doing particularly well, for example, in international tests. Is there any advice you would give to the Netherlands in terms of what they should be focusing on to improve the system? Because, of course, you see all kinds of things. Some people say, look at Finland, some people say, look at England, etc. What would be your advice?
Well, there's so many things to say there. I think there are two key lines of attack. One of them is investing time in teacher development. And I just think that's so important to have a professional culture where teachers are constantly motivated to find solutions to get students to learn more, to be more, to be more engaged and deepen their knowledge. So I think keeping teacher development time in school systems sort of sacrosanct and make sure it is embedded as a flow over time is so important, way beyond just the initial teacher training stage. So I don't know how effective that is, but I think that's key. And the second thing is to make sure the curriculum, that I mean, I'm a big fan of what in England we talk about being a knowledge-rich curriculum as a concept, because I feel where I encounter schools where the curriculum is, where things are less good than they could be, there's a sort of the ambition for what every student can do is sometimes impoverished, and it does mean everybody. So it's getting into the corners. It's easy to teach a few children something, but it's getting everyone and having that ambition for all of them. But be quite expansive in your view of what that curriculum is. It's not just about the sort of declarative knowledge that you can quiz. It's also things which are about experiences. So planning the curriculum sequence, so it's got a kind of richness to it, but also that it's ambitious, and you'll want it to be universal. You want all students to be able to engage with that knowledge, not just a select few. So it's the two things. It's really confident teachers delivering a really great curriculum. I mean, that sounds easy to say, but and then the other thing is then strip away the stuff around. If it's not about those two things, what could be more important than those two things? And then don't do things which are not about those two things, to focus on that. And then I think we're likely to improve more rapidly.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks very much for your insights. I'm sure lots of really useful stuff to take away from that. And obviously, I'd encourage everybody to read Rosenshine's Principles and Actions, read the walkthroughs, and work with that in the way that you've described. Thank you very much.